Welcome to the Northeast Kingdom Voice. I'm your host, Scott Wheeler. If you grew up here in the Northeast Kingdom during the 1980s, for some, it was the time to bring your garbage to the landfill. But for others, it was time to go to the landfill to watch the races at the Can-Am Speedway. Today, our guests are from the Vermont Historical Society. They are launching a project to record the history of racing in Vermont. Welcome to the show.
Hey, thanks for having us.
And I will let you both introduce yourselves.
Sure, I'm Steve Perkins. I'm the director of the Vermont Historical Society.
And I'm Amanda Guston. I'm a public program manager at the Historical Society.
Now, tell me, have either one of you ever been to a dump to go to the races? Or ever found entertainment at a dump?
Well, entertainment at a dump, certainly.
Yeah.
I mean, Saturday mornings at the dump is one of the best times every single week, and certainly can be entertaining, but I will admit I've never watched a race at the dump.
We used to go sledding in the winter
Right.
at a dump growing up, but not car racing.
Well, you know, ski jumping at the
Yeah.
dump, I guess the old UVM ski jump was at the Williston dump where I grew up.
Well, you know, it's somewhere in Virginia or something. If you Google it, there's a recreational park. It's called Mount Trashmore, and it's bicycling and everything. It's a capped over mountain that they've created into an a recreational park. Well, I saw what you were doing with this racing project, and I reached out to you because I've recorded a lot of racing history up here, and I just wanted to share some of my material. Now, where are you at in this project? Just at the beginning?
We're really just at the beginning, and we're starting to gather information and certainly traveling around the state and talking to folks like you and anyone else who has memories and photos and great stories about racing in Vermont. The goal is to have the exhibit installed in April of 2018. So about a year from now, we'll have the exhibit. And the exhibit will be in Barrie, and we hope to have programming both there and throughout the state.
Right. Are you finding that every area has, every geographic area had at least some kind of racetracks?
Yeah, that seems to be the case so far. We're getting a lot of people calling us a racetrack. Oh, for 18 months there was this tiny racetrack, or maybe it lasted for a couple of years, or a drag track or something like that. But it is a highly regional thing. Right. Even if they only, like I said, lasted for just a couple of years at a time. That being said, there are some places that have more than others. Right. At one point there were 6 or 7 tracks in Chittenden County during maybe roughly a 5 to 10 year span. And there were certainly quite a few down in the Northeast Kingdom, and some other parts of the state have fewer. But at various points, say from 1950 onwards, pretty much every part of the state you could easily get to a racetrack.
Were they, like up here, the races, they were actually called Jalopy Races, and these were not fancy cars. They were just old jalopies, and what I believe a lot of them they were actually driven by the men who were had returned home from war, and they probably had a little bit of adrenaline rush in war, and they used that adrenaline to race the tracks. But they weren't. The men were not the only ones. There were plenty of women racers.
Yeah, absolutely. We see that at both Thunder Road and Catamount Stadium, for example. There were some women there who had really great success as drivers. Someone told us a great story about growing up. His mother always had a bit of a lead foot, and she drove by a car one day and said, I should buy myself a race car. And the next thing they know, she had done so, ended up racing, I think at Catamount. So definitely this is a sport that women are involved in as well. And to your point about the adrenaline rush, there's something there, for sure. I agree. And there's also a continuity of racing in Vermont. We're finding references as early as the 19 teens, depending on how you define racing, right? We're looking at some early hill climb races and some long distance races. Horatio Nelson Jackson of Burlington, Vermont, famously the first person to drive cross country. In a car. Took him 63 days to get from one side of the country to the other.
My wife would tell you, with me driving, it would probably take about that now.
Well, he was fastest at the time.
Yeah. I mean, that was it kept breaking down. So, how much time did he lose because it broke down by the side of the road and he had to start all over again. But so we're really looking at a lot of different kinds of racing, not just the tracks and the jalopy racing like you're talking about. But I do think you're onto something there, that there is an adrenaline rush, that there's a need for speed, and that there's a keen interest in gadgets almost, and technology, and putting your hands on the cars and the love of the cars themselves.
And you got to remember, almost every community, even before cars were racing, like you had the horse races right down. I have photos of them having horse races right in the heart of Glover in the years as automobiles are starting to arrive on the scene. So it was actually a natural progression from horse races, because Barton Fair, or the Orleans County Fair, they're celebrating 150 years this year, and one of their staples was, and has always been, was and is horse racing.
Yep.
So it was probably a natural extension of that thrill. Well, I tell people North Country High School, which is on the east side of Newport, at the end of the day, probably people who live nearby think that's a racetrack, just because you know how kids are. You get out of school. Like I do know that if the city of Newport is needing some revenue, they go park their cars over there, and you can write tickets all day long. But that actually was a racetrack for many years. It was first a horse racing track over where North Country High School is today, but only for a year or two was it a jalopy track in the 1950s, and it was the place of thrills and spills. I have all kinds of photos of it, including this photo. That's like the standard, the standard car. They were just old. They were just old jalopies that people built them with their hands. Well, they took old cars. I've written all about it. I just can't remember how much the most expensive one was, but they weren't that expensive. And they would roll over. And the thing is, I interviewed a lot of the racers who are now passed. And there was this one who I interviewed too. I interviewed too, and he's gone, but I won't say his name because the other racers still bristled about him. Decades later, they still hated him because most of the people were out for fun. And this one racer, he was tough, and even in old age, he made no apologies. He said they can play around all they want. I was out to win, and he eventually was banned from the track. But these old folks I interviewed in their 80s and 90s, they still carried and they still harbored grudges for some of their races. But that wasn't the norm. The norm was they were just good old boys and girls having a good time. But that track was shut down because of the dust that it created going around in circles around. But that, if I understand right, that track originated out of Holland, Vermont, which is in the metropolitan city of Holland, which, tiny little community, and that's a photo of the Holland track. It's, no tar. Even the later tracks were not tar. But back to the Newport track, and here's a poster promoting the Jalopy Races. So we've had a great history of racing here.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's to what you say about the the rivalries and the drivers, still remembering blow by blow,
Right.
Every piece of the garage. That's absolutely something we found as well. And those are the kinds of stories we hope to incorporate into this project. We're going to be looking at a number of different aspects of racing. First, the places, the tracks, as you were saying,
Right.
those strong place memories of being at the high school or at the dump. Or at the state fair, or in some farmer's backfield in some cases. But we're also looking at the people, those drivers and the personalities and the interplays there, and the sense of community between not just the drivers, but the pit crew, the fans, the kids who grew up watching this and then became drivers themselves. And finally, looking at also the cars and the technology that played such an important role, because it's a sport that is dependent on an outside thing, on a piece of equipment, a large piece of equipment that you can tinker with endlessly, and part of the appeal definitely lies in that.
My first book was Rum Runners and Revenuers, Prohibition in Vermont. And, during that book, because I interviewed local people involved in the scene, as in Vermont people. But racing, there's a thing that racing actually arose out of the rum running days, because some of the early American racers, they got their start running from the police, and that's where the racing began.
Yeah, and it's those deep stories that really fascinate me. Is where did we start this idea of tinkering with cars? And we do look at that Prohibition era of you take a stock car, and what can we do under that hood that's going to make it outrun any revenue enforcement operator through the mountains of Vermont? And there's some of your earliest racing in the state.
Yeah, like with those rum cars.
Yeah.
You didn't just focus on the motor, but then you had to, if you were serious about your business and you're going to load them up, you had to put extra springs on, because so when the load didn't push it down, because you didn't want it to rest too low, because it would be once fully loaded, because people would notice. I know this is off the topic, but the one thing I really like is I love the gadgets they used for smoke screens. They'd have a hole down through the floor. And I read about these all the time in newspaper accounts. And then you'd have a jug of oil and or ammonia at the same time. And so when the lawmen got too close behind, they would pour it down through the hole right onto the muffler. And the black would create the smoke, well, the oil would create the smoke, and the ammonia would burn their eyes. And yeah, I don't think it worked very well. The other trick they used, though, is they actually threw money out sometimes, because the lawmen weren't paid that well. So if you're throwing out money, it was like, okay, I'm going to stop you.
Well, I mean, if we could bring this around, did any of these folks do these on any of these tracks that weren't, say, tightly regulated?
Could
some
be.
tricks and
any tricks happening on early tracks? Amanda's been doing some research on the state level in it, and we found it fascinating that the state or regulating agencies really didn't get into regulating drivers or cars or even their actions on the track. All they regulated was the track itself.
Right.
And specifically from a public safety angle. Are the barriers tall enough and thick enough to protect the crowds? But there's absolutely a resistance to, we'll police ourselves among the drivers and the owners and the track people themselves. So.
But you compare that to horse racing or later dog racing, down in southern Vermont, and the entire sport was regulated. But in auto racing, they didn't regulate. They aren't regulating the sport, just the track.
Right.
Yeah.
And you can't mention auto racing in Vermont without the fact that we have a sitting governor who is an auto racer. I've known the governor for a few years, because I once served in the Vermont House, and when he was getting ready to run for office, I would occasionally bump into him, and I'd say, "Hey, Phil, governors aren't even supposed to drive, because they don't. They have somebody driving for them." And he really didn't know whether he'd be able to drive. So I suggested to him that what he could do is he could let his bodyguard drive, and he would just sit there in the passenger seat and tell him when to turn, when to step on it. But I guess do you have any reason to know the details how he got around? Because governors don't drive. They have their like Governor Douglas told me. He said when he decided to step down as governor, one of his nephews or something got him a driver's manual just to brush him up on the rules of the road.
I don't know, but I mean, he's Governor Scott is racing.
Yeah.
Almost every week at Thunder Road. So.
Yeah, he just won the feature. What was it, last week or the week before?
2 weeks ago,
2
yeah.
weeks ago.
So tell me, I assume he's even though he's not a historical figure in racing, he's.
Hey, did it happen 2 weeks ago?
Yeah.
It's history.
Yeah.
So
you have my philosophy.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
We're going to talk about it.
Yeah.
History is these series of stories and these human interactions that just make, our life so much more rich, and it creates that community. And so we can talk about, hippie communes from the 1970s, or we can talk about, auto racing in the backwoods of Vermont. But all of those are very valid subjects to help us better understand, what makes us all Vermonters.
Has anybody gone on to race big time from Vermont? Do you know? Have you found anybody?
So, like I said, we're still at the really early stages. Certainly Vermont drivers have had success in sort of larger circuits than just local tracks in Vermont, have gone around the Northeast. And certainly there have been some drivers who have had more national success, who have come to race at the Vermont tracks. I think if you're looking at someone from Vermont who had the biggest national success, you're probably looking at someone like Ken Squire, who certainly went on to become extremely influential and in NASCAR itself.
The voice of
NASCAR.
Just inducted
Yeah.
into the Racing Hall of Fame.
Yep, just a couple of weeks ago. So, like I said, we're still in early research, so if one of your viewers knows of someone that they want to tell us about who had success, especially in the early days, and I think, when we think of auto racing, we so often think of that 1950 onward, the stock car racing, the established tracks, when NASCAR starts to come on the scene. But in early days, when driving is about celebrities with more money or teams with money that support them, you do get some famous drivers coming to Vermont to do exhibition races, particularly at the state fairs or the county fairs and things
Absolutely.
like that. So it's more a matter of, because there are fewer famous drivers,
Right.
just nationally, some of them are coming to Vermont, and also because New York and New York City is kind of a hotbed for early driving and early speed experiments. Some of the earliest races, like Vanderbilt Cup around the turn of the last century. Some of those drivers are coming up, and they're advertised. You see, so and so is coming to the Tunbridge Fair, or the Essex Fair to do an exhibition race. So early on, you do certainly absolutely get some famous people coming to Vermont, names that people who were following
Right.
cars and racing
Right.
would have recognized.
Well, it was the same way as like when air flight started picking up. Just started. You'd have famous barnstormers and that might end up in Barton, Vermont during the.
Yeah.
If somebody wants to contact you, how can they best contact you?
Yeah. So our website, vermonthistory.org, is the best sort of one-stop for anything you might want to know about the Historical Society, whether it's specifically about this project or about the other work we do, which covers everything you can possibly think of related to Vermont history. Reach out to us. But if you want specifically to talk to us about this project, you can get in touch with Steve or myself. Our contact information is on that website.
Can you put out a phone number just for people who don't use?
Yeah. Sorry, millennial shining through. So phone number 802-479-8500 will get you the main number at the Vermont Historical Society, and you can talk to us about whatever you want to talk to us there, and you'll be routed to the appropriate
And again,
person.
your name is?
I'm Amanda Gustin.
And Steve Perkins.
Right. I graduated from high school in 1984, and I remember this view quite well. It's the Can-Am Speedway, as we were talking about at the beginning, and that was just a good time. I don't even think you could do that today. If having it in a landfill, I doubt if you could, but it came in handy. The drivers told me that if the car broke down, you could go. Charlie, the owner of the landfill, would allow you to go scavenge parts off cars for the right price. It was a business for him, but the track wasn't. When he's fine, Charlie did the best he could. But being in a wet area and being in a landfill, sometimes things just didn't happen the way you see on TV. Sinkholes would open up, and there'd be huge puddles, and if it was dry out, the dust was just outrageous. Mm-hmm. But people went there to watch a good race, drink a lot of beer, and eat a lot of dust. It was a good time, though.
But makes that racing so interesting. I myself, I love to watch the rally racing for that exact reason, because you just don't know what they're going to run through next. Right. So it's a lot of fun. I think Vermonters have always loved this. I mean, it goes back to the title of our exhibit here: "Anything for Speed." Yeah, I think just a great statement.
We had a lot of Canadians who raced at the Can-Am Speedway too. There's Can-Am, Canadian, American, and the Nettos really did. They took this dump. Even though I understand they didn't like it being called dump, they were a little more PC. They liked it being sanitary landfill. But they brought a lot of thrills and fun for several years. I'm not exactly. I think I wrote when I interviewed Charlie, who unfortunately just passed away in recent weeks. I can't recall. I really can't recall why it ended, but just in the last couple years, that crew has started. To tick off, because 1980s, some of those guys were 30s and 40s when they were racing. Even former Representative Winston Dowling, he was the flag man, and he said he'd have to occasionally dodge a beer bottle, a wayward beer bottle that was thrown at him for a bad call.
Yeah.
But.
Yeah, so I think that's part of what makes something like this so timely, is that we are starting to lose those generations, that early drivers, early track officials. So Tom Curley just passed away recently, who was instrumental in organizing a number of Vermont tracks, Thunder Road, Catamount most specifically. And I do think that there's a burgeoning interest in telling these stories and connecting people to their history, and connecting this history to us at the Vermont Historical Society.
Yeah, and I think any of your viewers who are watching this and are interested in telling us that story, we're looking for the story, but do people also have objects that illustrate that story? It is a museum, so are there jackets? Are there trophies? Is there memorabilia? I mean, do you got an old car stuck out in the back barn that
or pieces of
a car? We got to fit it through the door. That would work really well to tell that story of racing in Vermont. And it's an area where museums historically really haven't collected, so we don't have a huge collection in our museum, and there really aren't many museums in Vermont that collect items from Vermont's racing history. So it's nice for us to start doing that.
I must have, I believe I have, must be a few dozen, well, probably 30, 40 images of racing in the Northeast Kingdom, along with scorecards and everything. And then, they came from scans from people I've interviewed, like one fella that, if he's watching this, I suspect he might contact you, is Al Haver. His family was involved in racing as far back as, the racing in Holland and the racing in Newport. He was only a kid at that point. But the last I knew is he was a young man in the 1950s, but he's still racing at some of the other races now that he's able to race. So he's had a lifetime career, and he has a treasure trove of memorabilia. I've scanned most of them, But so there are people out there
Oh, definitely.
still alive. I do believe there's. Come to think about it, there is one racer still alive. I'll talk to you about him off the air. You might want to. I think he's the last of the originals up here.
Wow.
That's great.
So, anything else you'd like to share? First of all, I really got to say is I think what you're doing is super, because I think sometimes when we look at a history of any place, we look for the, as I call it, the white picket fences, the quaint, the quaint stuff.
Yeah.
And no, that isn't what makes. That stuff is important, but sometimes it's the nitty gritty, dirty stuff of eat and dust that on these racetracks. It's really, or like your last project was the commune movement, and it really is what Vermont is. It's the hodgepodge of it. We're not, Vermont is not necessarily a very quaint state. It was built on the backs of hard sweat and hard play, and I really appreciate the way you're approaching this because, I think you're doing a super job.
Well, thank you. And we're so excited about it, and hope you can come down when we open this exhibit,
sure.
and we'll have a grand time. Maybe we can do another program
no.
up here. We'll bring more stories and photos and all sorts
Yeah,
of stuff.
because you'll probably look back and think, wow, this is, at the time of this show, we didn't have anything. And I'm sure you might get even banners or
Hope so.
or
We
something.
hope so.
And it's like that poster we put up before. That would be kind of neat for you to blow up and just for a piece of memorabilia. And it's just no, I think you guys are doing a great job. So your final words.
Final words. Contact us. Let us know your story, because these stories really matter. Everybody's story matters.
Yeah, absolutely. And we're absolutely looking forward to talking with everyone and adding more nuance and detail and more color to our story.
So now, if you were a race car driver, how would you do?
How would I do as a race car driver? Probably not as well as my wife. Man, she can drive like you wouldn't believe, at great rates of speed. So I'm probably more of your endurance drivers. I'd do well in an endurance race.
And how would you do?
Oh, I would do terribly. I'm sorry. I would race horses all day long, but I would not make that switch to cars easily. I'd be one of those Vermonters, I guess.
My wife, she will tell you I would be the most dismal race car driver, because my idea, when we're in a hurry to get somewhere, we have two of our sons who live in northern Maine, and she'll say, step on it, and I'll say, I've got, and if it's 65 miles, I have my power, I have my my thing, cruise control, set at 67 and a 65, and I think like my hair's being, well, I don't have much hair, but she'd be right there with your wife. She'd be banging doors with her because she can drive. So, okay, hey, thanks for coming on, and thanks for making the trip.
Absolutely.
From down south.
Down south. I suppose everywhere's from down south.
That's true, unless you're coming from Canada.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
And thank you to the viewers for tuning in to another segment of the Northeast Kingdom Voice.